I've got to admit, this isn't quite what I envisioned for working lunch. For some reason, I had an image of us all around a table, actually sitting and eating our food and having a more informal conversation. But in order to compensate, do come forward. I appreciate it. In order to compensate for that, what I'll try to do in any case is keep us as informal and friendly and open as possible, and encourage as much participation as possible as well. One of the ways of doing that, of course, is to keep my panelists to time and ask them to just simply make a few provocative marks on their topics before having a more working lunch type of discussion. If we are talking about a legal research agenda for the legal preparedness for the global green economy, and in particular the trade and investment law implications of climate change measures and policies, as well as what trade and investment measures can contribute to the goal of climate-compatible development, then I think we need a space for a broad and open conversation about what that agenda will be. It's not yet clear where some of the more controversial points will land, either in these UNFCCC negotiations or in the continuing conversations at the regional level, in the investment treaties, and also in, of course, the WTO Doha Development Agenda. So it is a great pleasure to provide a space for this type of working lunch conversation, in part because while my day job might be as head of economic growth and trade for the International Development Law Organization, I have for many years been a member of the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, and with about 120 lawyers, mainly from developing country law faculties and organizations, we've been able to do some fascinating research that I learn from all the time. If we are going to continue doing this research, I would like this research to be informed by you, your views, your ideas, and especially, of course, the insights that you could contribute and the demands that you see coming in the future. So this type of working lunch is very, very helpful to us as a research center. We hope it might also be helpful, of course, to others who are taking on different issues and different work in this field. So the exchange of views is crucial. What I will do is quickly introduce Professor Marcus Gehring, who is Sustainable Development Law Professor at Cambridge University, Faculty of Law, and also Jean Monnet Chair in Sustainable Development Law at the University of Ottawa. And I believe the chair, and we must say thank you to the Jean Monnet program at the European Union and also to the University of Ottawa for sponsoring this session. So Marcus will lay out a little bit the agenda for us.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, the sort of intellectual flow of this session, Marie-Claire just omitted. So we're first talking about transition to a green economy in general, and I will touch on the trade and investment implications. We will then move on to regional trade law, look at, after that, Sébastien will look at human rights considerations, and finally we're going to, Sarah is going to look at how RED can contribute to the transition to a green economy. These slides will be available, so I will click through some of them rather quickly just to point out quickly that, yeah, it's thanks to my chair that we're here today, or I'm here in South Africa, actually. And I'd like to thank the two universities that employ me, the University of Cambridge and the University of Ottawa. But most of my research is done with CISDL, and CISDL focuses on sustainable development law. Sustainable development law, in our view, lies at the intersection of international environmental law, international social law, including human rights, and international economic law. There's a lot of debate about the legal status of sustainable development in international economic law. I think it suffices to say that it is a recognized objective of international economic law, and it gives color, texture, and shading to our view of international economic commitments. So having said all this, I think we need to realize that the transition to a low-carbon green economy has to happen in the context of sustainable development. And here I have just copied some of the insights from the objectives and themes of the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, the report of the Secretary General, in preparation of the Rio conference next year. And what is particularly important here is that there's no single approach to a green economy. But similarly, with regards to sustainable development, it will look different for every nation state. So therefore, rather than agreeing internationally on specific measures that we need to adopt if we transition to a green economy, the Secretary General report has grouped economic policies in 7 clusters. And as we discovered yesterday in the Trade and Climate Symposium, the devil is in the detail in how you structure these policies. So what can you do if you want to transition to a green economy? You can adopt green stimulus packages. You can adopt eco-efficiency measures. You can green markets and introduce green elements into public procurement. You can invest in sustainable infrastructure. You can restore and enhance natural capital. You can try to get the prices right, and you can engage in eco-tax reform. And as Ahmed had also on his slide, when it comes to IP, the same is true for trade and investment. Trade, investment, and the green economy don't have a black and white relationship. Rather, there are shades of gray, as Scott Vaughan concluded when he wrote at the turn of the century about the relationship between trade and the environment in the WTO special study. Ideally, international economic law will foster and not frustrate the transition to a green economy. The current international economic law hinders, permits, or supports green economy measures. So it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. I think you will find varying degrees. And so what we did in the CRSDL, we tried to identify the opportunities and the challenges, and then ways how to overcome the challenges if there are such challenges. I should also mention that this presentation focuses on investment law because we just finished a large study that resulted in a book which I couldn't bring to South Africa because it's quite heavy and better used as a piano prop than anything else. Sustainable Development in World Investment Law, co-edited with Marie Claire and Andrew Newcomb. Because investment law is not necessarily the main domain for a trade audience, just to recap, international investment agreements have been concluded. The current international legal framework is comprised of a network of now over 3,000 international investment agreements. Most of them are in force. What do? They seek to create favorable conditions and a stable framework for investment, for economic development, by imposing binding obligations on states regarding the treatment of foreign investments. And they share some commonalities, even though the details between the bilateral treaties is quite significant, but they all contain wide definitions of investments, guarantees of non-discrimination, a minimum standard of treatment, often expressed as fair and equitable treatment, coupled with an obligation not to impose arbitrary or discriminatory measures, the right to transfer investment and profits out of the host state, and potentially high compensation for measures tantamount to expropriation. A number of very far-reaching investment agreements also contain rights of entry for foreign investment, prohibitions on performance requirements, and stabilization clauses under which a state commits to freeze domestic regulatory developments. And why is that of concern to a sustainable development lawyer? Because we have seen in NAFTA disputes, and I've just put them here on the slide, that even environmental laws can be subject to an investor-state challenge. So what are we expecting? What are we expecting when it comes to green economy measures? The way you implement these green economy measures will matter from an investment law analysis. What our, and this is just a summary, what our analysis concludes, however, is that you can adopt all these measures as long as you comply with certain requirements. So when you're implementing a green stimulus package, don't just favor your own business sector. You cannot discriminate against foreign companies if they're also complying with certain criteria that you're setting in your green stimulus package, right? Or if you're trying to green a market and engage in public procurement, well, again, right, you have to observe fair and equitable treatment concerning your foreign investors. I've listed the Vattenfall 2 case because it illustrates a little bit what you should or shouldn't do. Vattenfall is a Swedish company, and Vattenfall has launched an investor-state dispute against the government of Germany because Germany is phasing out nuclear power, as we all know. But I think this dispute will not lead anywhere, will not lead to a compensation claim. Why not? Because Germany is not phasing out nuclear power tomorrow. Germany is phasing out nuclear power by the year 2023, maybe 2024. That's a long transition period. So what you have to observe in investment law is to be transparent, to be accountable, to have a predictable government policy. Do not, as Aaron said in his session yesterday, do not introduce a feed-in tariff and then in the next election abolish the feed-in tariff again. Those kind of unpredictable government policies could give rise to investor-state claims, and if it's the example that I just gave, then investment law can even have a positive effect on the transition to a green economy, because it kind of safeguards certain transition measures that the governments have put in place. Yeah, you also, in the design of your domestic green economy measures, have to observe WTO law. And does that mean there are certain things you can't do? No. In the majority of measures that we looked at, we found no contradiction to WTO obligations as long as they're designed and implemented in a way that is non-discriminatory, that is transparent, that allows the traders to actually know what the rules are. What are some of the concerns that have been raised? For a green stimulus package, you have to observe the subsidies agreement. For eco-efficiency measures, you have to observe the TBT. And the Tuna Dolphin 3 case that was decided in October gives us some guidance as to how to design a labeling scheme. If you're trying to green markets and engage in public procurement, be mindful of your non-discrimination obligations under the most favored nation and the national treatment clauses, and try to take into account as much as possible the agreement on public procurement if you've signed up to that plurilateral agreement. Infrastructure, could give rise to TRIM's concerns. Restoration or enhancement of natural capital could mean you need to look at the subsidies agreement and so forth. Why am I so comfortable saying that if you design the measure right, it doesn't give rise to concerns? Well, because in all these areas, member states to the WTO have actually formally notified the different committees of measures they have already taken. And while that is not a guarantee for that these measures are actually legal, it creates a presumption of lawfulness if there's no concern raised in the TBT agreement, and therefore contributes to the treaty practice under the WTO. So Canada has announced eco-efficiency standards. The EU emission trading was discussed in the trade policy review mechanism. Forestry and land use subsidies have been notified by Argentina and Armenia. Packaging has been discussed in the trade policy review mechanism report for the Maldives and Guyana. And the preferential tax use of waste material has been notified by China. And so I'm drawing here on the environmental database that the Trade and Environment section of the WTO Secretariat puts out. A wonderful resource. I strongly recommend everybody should take a look at it. What I'm saying here is we already have most of these measures, maybe not in the climate context, maybe in the waste or land use context. But in my view, that suggests that you can actually easily adopt them without creating WTO concerns. I'm running out of time, therefore there's lots that could be said about what needs to be changed in trade and investment law. It's not without flaws. Certainly, if we lived in an ideal world, I could give you some of my suggestions, and Patrick will tell you that some of these suggestions have been taken up in the regional or bilateral trade context. So we know that some people, some member states of the WTO have already engaged in these sustainable development innovations. Wonderful reading materials also always produced by the ICTSD, who add to the economic analysis that we don't necessarily do. So what's my conclusion? Many measures which could be useful for a smooth transition to a green economy are already used in other contexts. Key elements to reduce WTO concerns include transparency, notification and TPRM discussions. Take note of the trade effects. Often measures don't seem to generate significant trade effects. Focus on allowed subsidies, which are not considered trade distorting. Reduce the space for countervailing duties. Make standards transparent and open for foreign companies. And consider voluntary over mandatory labeling standards. So what does that leave us with? The transition to a green economy with benefits in the fight against poverty is generally manageable without raising trade concerns or investment concerns, just like the environmental objectives could also be achieved in other areas. While some WTO and investment rules could pose limits on green economic policies, if carefully crafted, they either don't give rise to WTO investment concerns or can be defended based on their public policy objectives. There is room for improvement. Regulatory chill is largely a matter of perception. And as you would expect from an academic, further research on the interaction between domestic green economy measures and trade investment rules is advised. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus, especially for covering such a wide array of measures and forums, yet still being able to point to specific sources of data, specific research that has been done, and specific cases and measures that need to be considered in the context of a green economy. I'm going to challenge our other speakers to be similarly or even more brief, literally just highlighting some of the key points that you think need to be on the agenda for a working lunch discussion. And that's partly because I have finished the lunch that was permitted to me, which is 5 celery sticks, and I noticed that many of the people here in the room are finished their lunch and so are ready now to bring some of their own points to bear in this conversation. I should also just quickly note that speaking of cross-fertilization of ideas, laws, and economics along with research, this session, in a way, will build on and will complement a similar session in the law conference this weekend at KwaZulu-Natal Law Faculty, which IDLO, CISDL, and other partners hosted, where Ahmed and Ricardo and others from the ICTSD were kind enough to bring their expertise and their knowledge to bear. So I'm looking forward to thinking about this from within the context of trade law, rather than just within the context of climate change law, and seeing what kind of mutual supportiveness we can build. And to help us with that, we have Patrick Reynaud, who's Senior Manager of the CISDL, and also one of the brightest and up-and-coming scholars in this area, in particular having just finished an 8-month study of over 70 regional trade agreements, including some of the very new ones between the European Union, Central America, the European Union CARIFORUM, the European Union, Colombia, and Peru, and others. So I think Patrick will help us a great deal in explaining some of the innovations that are possible in the transition to the green economy and how they can be carefully negotiated into one's trade agreement for a deal on development, growth, and the environment. Patrick.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mary Claire. I promise to be very brief. In fact, I'll try and take only 5 minutes to allow my colleagues to speak, and then more time for discussion from the floor. As Mary Claire mentioned, the research that I'm going to be talking about now is the result of a joint CISDL research project that's been conducted over the past year or so, analyzing a great number of regional trade agreements, including also the impact assessment of the regional trade agreements. So I'm going to start by talking about, very briefly, about some of the main types of impacts that we've highlighted, and then again talk very briefly about some of the opportunities and that can be seen through analysis of these impacts. So I'm going to start by talking a bit about regulatory impacts, which are evidently legitimate concerns of states and other stakeholders in the regional trade agreement negotiation process. Now, as we know, trade agreements can infringe the ability of states to pursue sustainable development directly, either by explicitly committing the state not to implement some types of law or negotiations, or by allowing investors, for example, to prevent or negotiate changes on domestic laws. One first type of regulatory impact can refer to conflict between obligations under regional trade agreements and other international commitments, for example, specific trade obligations contained in multilateral environmental agreements. For instance, the Montreal Protocol contains measures restricting trade with non-parties to the protocol in goods that contain or were produced using prohibited ozone-depleting substances. Unfortunately, the relationship between multilateral environmental agreements and RTA trade obligations are as yet far from clear. Another type of regulatory constraint refers to the direct impact on domestic legal initiatives for sustainable development. Impact assessments can play a very important role in identifying and attempting to prevent these regulatory problems. I also want to talk very briefly about another type of impact, which are material impacts. We know that trade liberalization can have positive, negative, or perhaps no impact on sustainable development, depending on the different contexts. However, areas with pre-existing economic, social, or environmental vulnerabilities can be particularly at risk in the trade liberalization process if flanking or mitigating measures are not implemented concurrently. For instance, in the European Union Sustainability Impact Assessment of the EU-Chile Association Agreement, pollution from chemical and non-ferrous metal industries already pose a significant environmental and health hazard in Chile. So this is something that had to be particularly taken into account in the negotiation of this particular regional trade agreement. The last type of impact that I want to highlight, again, very briefly here, are integration impacts. And so these refer to trade liberalization promoting the wrong kind of growth. Integration impacts occur essentially when trade treaties promote growth in unsustainable sectors of the economy, for instance, promoting trade in coal or other high-emitting minerals. So these can be unsustainable sectors, can be areas that states have multilaterally agreed to phase out, or that are particularly harmful to the environment or social well-being, or sometimes that are simply illegal. Now, so there's different, and I want to focus a little bit on the solutions and opportunities and the integration impacts in particular, just to finish off this very brief presentation, as different types of mitigating and flanking measures actually have already been implemented by different states in a variety of regional trade agreements, including by the EU and sometimes the US. And so these are sort of constructive, sustainable development-oriented trade rule enhancement initiatives. So for instance, sanitary and phytosanitary provisions which promote scientific cooperation and risk assessment to improve levels of health or environmental protection. Government procurement provisions also, which make public purchasing of sustainable development goods and services more affordable. Technical barriers to trade provisions to implement non-discriminatory certification processes and promote mutual recognition. Intellectual property right provisions can also be important that support biodiversity protection and the recognition of traditional knowledge. And just to cite one or two more, we can talk about measures to secure additional liberalization on environmental goods and services. As we know, this process has been a major roadblock in the Doha round of negotiations under the World Trade Organization. However, in regional trade agreements, bilaterally or multilaterally, we've seen a lot more opportunities in terms of being able to define what an environmental good and service is. I'll leave it at that because I want to leave other speakers the time to present, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. Although I would want to flag that at least the ESG negotiations in WTO, I'm not certain that it's the negotiations themselves that are the roadblock, although they've had trouble, but rather the rest of the round that is waiting on other decisions in order to be able to achieve some progress there. That being said, you're perfectly correct that we've seen some fascinating provisions on low-carbon economies being promoted and organic agriculture being promoted in some of the regional trade agreements that go quite a bit further than what we've been able to achieve so far in the CTE and in the WTO. Right. Next, I have Sébastien Jodoin, who is a Trudeau scholar. He's teaching and also completing a DPhil, a PhD, betraying my origins, at Yale University, and he is, most importantly, of course, the lead counsel for climate change with the CISDL. So, Sébastien, could you please go ahead with your brief intervention?
Sure. Okay, yes, thanks, Mary-Claire. I'm just going to sort of briefly talk about the relationship between the green economy and the human rights generally, and then I'll give 5 examples of how they can interact. So one question we can ask is, are human rights and the green economy fundamentally incompatible? There are certainly some who would hold that view. There are others who would say they run in the same direction. If you read the UNEP definition of a green economy, it's an economy that results in increased human well-being and social equity, while significantly reducing environmental risks and ecological scarcities. That would seem to be something that would be completely compatible with a human rights agenda. Oddly enough, or as you know, the green economy is one of the themes of the upcoming Rio +20 summit, and many international organizations have submitted submissions to the process on November 1st, and all of the UN High Commissioners submitted submissions except the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. It's very odd. The High Commissioner for Refugees put in a submission, but not the one for human rights. So we don't know what the official UN High Commissioner for Human Rights position is on the green economy, but if we look back at their sort of earlier statements on trade liberalization and when they have engaged with the WTO, they've always said that trade liberalization, that there's no actual human rights position on trade liberalization, and that it's a means to an end, which is human welfare. What needs to be taken into account, though, are the ways in which the green economy agenda can support or undermine the human rights agenda in different ways. And there are threats and opportunities. And I'll just highlight 5. First of all, the green economy is supposed to be creating green jobs. But we also can expect that jobs will be lost in a transition. Let's remember the enthusiasm around the knowledge economy and the similar disappearance of manufacturing jobs in industrialized countries. Measures need to be taken in the transition to a green economy, adequate protection tailored to vulnerable individuals and groups that mitigate the negative employment effects of a transition to a green economy. This is what the International Labour Organization calls the decent work agenda, and what people working in the labor rights movement call a just transition. And I think the concept originating in the European Commission of flexicurity is one that can be quite helpful here. And maybe, Marcus, you can comment on that. Okay, number 2, payment for ecosystem services. So this is another of the green economy measures. Obviously, it can reduce poverty and empower populations. It could protect the rights to food, shelter, and health, because this is what, in protecting ecosystem services, we're protecting the access to food and medicines and the watershed services that are vital to populations all over the world. It can lead to poverty reduction. But it could also undermine these rights. And we are seeing that in a number of PES schemes all over the world, where, for instance, large companies end up actually obtaining the rights to land or buying the rights to land. So there's definitely risk of land grabbing in the way in which some of these schemes are put into place. And what's vital, of course, is to ensure that any payment for ecosystem services mechanism ends up enhancing rather than undermining the rights, land rights, tenure security of populations that depend on those ecosystem services. Okay, number 3, one of the key ideas of the green economy agenda, according to UNEP, is the need to internalize externalities. And that also means internalizing externalities from ecological risks. And one area here where this could definitely be, there could definitely be some synergies with the human rights agenda, is to think of those ecological risks as being, at least in part, about protecting individuals from the harm, from environmental harm and pollution. And so how can you extend the concept of externalities to focus, on how those environmental externalities actually affect human well-being. Okay, number 4, the idea that UNEP is pushing as well is new taxes on pollution, right? New taxes on things that harm the environment, which of course makes a lot of sense. But again, it's important to look at who would be affected by those new taxes. Who in a specific country depends on petrol for energy or transportation? Who would be unlikely to be able to move to another energy source? Same with charcoal, the same with coal. And so if we're going to tax the things that harm the environment, we also need to make sure that these new taxes don't harm some of the most vulnerable people who are still dependent on these polluting or harmful energy sources. Finally, one last example, green trade and investment. And here I think the importance is there is a growing practice of sustainability impact assessments. There's a growing practice also of human rights impact assessments. And this is one way to deal with to ensure, it's a mechanism to ensure, right, that any sort of new trade agreements or trade measures or investment measures that target green goods and services are done in a way that doesn't undermine human rights. And so it's a tool that can be used in a context-specific way, and it can be a very valuable tool if it's done seriously. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, and for especially bringing that often less visible and certainly highly important perspective of human rights to the conversations around environment and economy, which obviously without paying attention to social development and to human rights makes a conversation about sustainable development extremely impoverished. So that is an extremely helpful contribution. Last but certainly not least, Sarah Mason-Case, who is a legal specialist with the International Development Law Organization and also serves as an associate fellow with the CISDL, might give us just a few last nuggets of information and consideration on the transition to the green economy and the role of economic measures, taking into account in particular her leading studies on legal preparedness for REDD+.
Sure. So REDD+ and the green economy, how do they relate to each other? Well, REDD+ is one of the many mechanisms that can promote a kind of low carbon, climate resilient, and I'll add green economy here because that terminology is really interchangeable at the moment, I think. So in the absence, at the present moment, and I don't want to be too negative about it, but at the present moment, in the absence of a global comprehensive regime, under the UNFCCC, what Victor and Cohen call a kind of climate change regime complex. REDD+ fits properly under there, also called by Elinor Ostrom a polycentric approach to climate change mitigation and environmental protection. So whereas REDD+ has now recently been recognized by the UNFCCC, it actually precedes it in some ways in terms of a kind of a larger PES scheme and fed into the voluntary market at one point, and is part of this growing trend towards other types of low carbon, climate resilient mechanisms such as food standards, business standards, efficiency standards that don't necessarily fit properly within the UNFCCC. In some ways we see the global regime also accepting this kind of green economy approach by things like NAMAs and the NAP, which provide a kind of accounting mechanism, but at the same time understand that we'll have all sorts of different sources of finance and all sorts of different mechanisms interacting at the same time, and REDD+ fits right under there. But REDD+ is not just about climate change, it's also about the social aspects that it can provide, so that's where the development aspect comes in. And that's because REDD+ links forests to the economy, because it seeks to use the value of the services that forests provide in a sustainable manner, so that we're switching from the brown to the green. We're no longer necessarily using forests simply for timber and mining, etc., but we're using it instead in a different way that can still generate the types of benefits that we gain from the timber industry. So what are those benefits? They include things like jobs. They include things like income that we can then use for social development, for healthcare, for education, etc. So REDD+ is not just about the monetary benefits, it's about trying to create a market that generates income that we can actually use for social development, and that's something that's really important to remember. How does this relate to trade and investment? For the very obvious reasons, in any kind of carbon market, we're concerned about things like fungibility. So when we're looking at generating carbon credits, we want to make sure that REDD+ in the global mechanism under the UNFCCC is going to link up with our voluntary standards that we know are already active. So that's one particular issue. Also, tax treatment, for instance, of carbon credits when we're trading them internationally. Who owns the carbon credits, and is there a royalty that's paid to government? Is it communities that own them themselves? And of course, we need to create an enabling investment environment, and that's where the investment comes in from trade and investment, to ensure that we actually inject investment to encourage whether they're carbon credits or whatever else we gain from the REDD+ mechanisms. In terms of the legal preparedness sides of things, I will say that IDLO, along with UN REDD program and FAO, recently conducted 3 studies in Vietnam, Mexico, and Zambia, looking specifically at what are the legal options to ensure that REDD+ is viable, that REDD+ is equitable, that REDD+ actually secures both sustainability of mitigation at the same time as social benefits. And so that relates to the trade and investment, obviously, because we want it to be viable. We want to ensure that people can actually invest in countries that may not have the social infrastructure right now to tap into sources of foreign investment. But it's also related to what Sébastien was speaking about in terms of safeguarding the social aspects. And I'll even add to that it's not just about safeguarding the social aspects and mitigating the harm, but what it's actually trying to do is incentivize and enhance, and that's the language that's actually used in the Cancun agreements, incentivize and enhance the social benefits that can come from REDD+. The legislation involved is extremely complex, just like climate change, because REDD+ is complex. It's about addressing the drivers of deforestation and forest degradation and making that switch. So it's land tenure, defining carbon rights, forest governance. Those are the easy, visible ones. But it also has to do with easements and acquisitions. It has to do with tax treatments. And it also has to do with making other industries, such as renewable energy, if our driver is the energy industry, sustainable agriculture, if our driver is unsustainable agriculture, actually viable in these countries. I'll end there, but I just want to send out one kind of piece of food for thought, which is a note that many countries right now, we very often view REDD+ as creating a new international carbon market that will flow through the UNFCCC. But there are a lot of countries that also want to create REDD+ with a certain amount of domestic ownership. And so one of the other true legal issues that marries law and economics is not just about how we can tap into international investment, foreign investment, but how do we actually mobilize capital at the domestic level so that REDD+ projects can be built from the ground up.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. Well, considering this is a working lunch, I suppose food for thought is particularly relevant and helpful. What I'd like to do now is to just ask if people would be able to introduce themselves and also add any thoughts, comments, or ideas into this mix. I mean, you've had a series of very brief sets of provocative remarks, at least everyone I think was hoping to be provocative. Mark is giving an overview of some of the more interesting measures that have been notified to the WTO and also that have resulted in investment law cases, and thinking about how they might help us in or hinder us in the transition to the green economy, and in particular in our climate change law and policy making. Patrick then providing a few ideas of innovations from some of the recent studies we've been doing on regional trade agreements, although I think there's quite a bit more in there that he wasn't able to focus on, so feel free to ask him about specific concerns raised in sustainability impact assessments that have found their way into chapters of regional trade agreements. Sebastian bringing in the important elements from human rights law, and in particular how one might design measures, legal measures, in a way that not only respects but actually promotes the realization, the full realization of human rights. And then Sarah giving us some specific examples of that with regards to climate finance and how the REDD+ mechanisms might take into account both the human rights and the climate law concerns and obligations that we are all laboring under and hopefully supporting the development and refinement of. What I would like to do, if possible, is actually just imagine we were around a round table and we were having a working lunch. I would immediately turn to the people who are in the room and say, you know, let's do a round table and give us your ideas, your feedback. Obviously, the CISDL is particularly interested in understanding what might be the legal research agenda in this area, where curriculum development might be most helpful, and what kinds of publications are needed in the next 5 or 6 years on these issues. But you might have other ideas, concerns, thoughts, agenda items that you'd like to place, and the floor is yours. We could start with the gentleman over here, if you like. There should be a roving microphone, which I presume is necessary so that we can be recorded and available to others who couldn't make it to Durban.
Hello. Hello. I'm Héctor Velasco. I'm from Mexico. I'm from the Colegio de Abogados por el Ambiente, which is a small organization of young lawyers for the environment. I also teach environmental law at ITAM, and I'm a fellow of the IDLO. The main reason why I'm here is that I'm planning to host an event at ITAM in Mexico about the Mexican transition to the green economy next September, so you're all invited, of course. Provided you can go by your own means. We don't have enough budget to take you all. And one of the main issues in Mexico, as Marcus pointed out, is the Chapter 11 of the NAFTA agreement, which you just pointed out. For example, the metal clad case, in which we have some safeguards to foreign investment in Mexico. So I was, thinking one of the main issues that how does that affect Mexican transition to the green economy?
I guess we need to turn around, do we? Yeah. Thank you. It's a little after lunch exercise. Thank you. I'm Tom Brewer. I'm a Schiller Foundation Fellow in Germany. I'm an American citizen and resident most of the year. One observation and then one question. Is it okay to ask a question? I've done a lot of research on a closely related area, and I think that your expansion of the analytic domain, if I can use that term, the expansion of the analytic domain in 2 ways. One, much more into investment, as distinguished from trade in a narrow sense. And secondly, at a non-multilateral level as well as a multilateral level, including bilateral and regional agreements, is fantastic. You should have started 10 years ago, but it's good that you're doing it now. And that leads me to a question about the relationship between what you're doing analytically and what the diplomats are or are not doing politically. Does your work not only add to our understanding of a very complicated system, and in some sense complicate our lives analytically, which is okay, but will your work somehow help the diplomatic process get out of the impasse that it seems to be stuck in? I mean, you're looking at other venues, you're looking at other combinations of countries, 2 at a time, 7 at a time, and so forth. And so you're sort of mixing up things analytically a lot. And what I want to know is, can you somehow figure out, if not today, over the next couple of years, how that work could actually get the diplomatic community out of the impasse it seems to be in? Thank you.
Gosh, that's a great question. I'm going to take comments from the rest of the round table, or at least anybody who would like to make a comment in the round table, because I know that time is short, but then I'm going to try to give 1 minute to respond.
Hello, my name is Hung. I'm an IDLO legal officer. I'm from Vietnam. I have the question that Sarah. I found very interesting to listen to the linkages between RESPLUS and green economy. So could you have some explanation about the linkages between CDM and green economy? Thank you.
This would expand our agenda even further, which I think is quite necessary. Go ahead, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Wasisira Shezi. I am 16 years old, and I'm representing my high school. basically here to get some help and to choose my career. But anyways, I wanted to know perhaps, would it work out if maybe governments decided to see which people, if they made taxes, which people would be affected badly, but it perhaps maybe if they separate them, and those people who can make those changes, would it perhaps work if governments were more harsh on them?
Excellent question as well. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Robin Eckersley. I'm from the University of Melbourne and a professor of political science. I'd just like to ask a more generic question about the green economy. Obviously, this is going to be a very difficult concept to get any conceptual agreement about, but clearly it's lacking. What we have is a shopping list of things you can do to help to green an economy, using the word green as a verb, and we have some very broad goals. But between that, we don't have any kind of conceptual framework, and I wonder how much it really remains compatible with neoliberalism, or whether we need to move to some other framework, because what seems to be missing here is an analysis of the scale effect. And the WTO UNEP report made it quite clear that no matter how much eco-efficiency you improve, it's still overwhelmed by the scale effect. And the more you integrate with trade and investment, the more you increase specialisation and exchange, and it does what all the trade economists tell us it must do, which is increase overall output. And to the extent to which you just rely on eco-efficiency, you also get the rebound effect. So is there any thinking about international sustainable development law that can wrestle with that monster, which is called the scale effect, because that seems to be totally missing in all the analyses I've heard so far?
Excellent, thank you. And the short answer is yes, but I know we only have a few more minutes. Yeah. So I'd like to let other people who have comments or questions or things they'd like to say, we can keep passing the microphone back to at least 3 more comments. I think the comments of the round table, the working lunch, are more important than us giving comprehensive examples and answers now. If you don't have a comment, you don't have to ask, but if you do, I think we're going to try to make enough space for that.
Thank you very much. I'm José Luis Salazar from the Barcelona Bar Association, Environmental Law Department, and also from the foundation that is Climate and Business from Spain. I have several points in connection to make to the panel, in connection to the green economy transition. The first is about the policies that are established in the European Union, in principle, are being developed in sustainable production and consumption. This is the first point. Of course, this is already a quite important, a big point. And also the reform of the common agricultural policy, of course, will be a key matter at the European Union level on this transition to the green economy is another point. And then there is another point or question that has been mentioned in the panel, that is eco-tax reform. Of course, this is easy to say, but how? I mean, it's important to define the steps, how to have it comprehensive, equitable, and balanced. Socially also has been mentioned about human rights and so on. Let me see. And then another point that is about multilateral environmental agreements. It's very clear from this session, also yesterday's session, we see that coordination and get the right balance that is not easy between WTO rules and multilateral environmental agreements is quite a challenge, and it's necessary to look into that. And then a final issue that is quite detailed, but I have a question and some doubts. You remember that recently, I think it was from Cancun, from COP16, it was established some sort of link between Kyoto Protocol and the Stockholm Convention. I would like to know more about if this is being developed, where is leading this. I know that it's quite detailed about one particular multilateral environmental agreement, that is Stockholm Convention in relationship to Kyoto Protocol. And then a final comment or thought for the transition, just very final, for the transition to the green economy. I think it's important for the follow-up of the work to think also about institutional economics. As you know, is the economic analysis of law or the right. That is quite important source also of information in this issue. Thank you very much.
Those are really excellent points, and each of them has food for thought for many years to go forward. Last two comments from people who are sitting around the table, sitting around the imaginary lunch table. No, we're good? Okay. What I'd like to do, because we're being asked if we could wrap up the session as quickly as possible, is simply give 1 minute each to the 4 people up here to answer 1 or 2 of the comments that are brought up, and then encourage bilateral conversations on the future research agenda. The one that I can answer myself is in particular the question about linking the analytical work that's being done that looks at bilaterals, regionals, and the global system, trade, investment, and actually, I don't want to scare you, but finance as well, with the climate negotiations that are going on and how to resolve impasses. There's a very, very straightforward answer to that, and I think you're already moving us toward it by the type of question you asked. When there's a commitment to develop a low-carbon economy that you find in a trade agreement, if that commitment is implemented and the green jobs start to come forward and it starts to actually be clear that the economic growth that is promised will be delivered in this new area, then I think we can hope that people will be willing to believe us and risk things with us and put their very livelihoods at stake. The commitment in the treaty is a start. That's all. Once we actually see some implementation happening, that's when some of the changes we need will become more real and impasses might start to resolve themselves. And I think this might come a little bit toward the beginnings of an answer to the question about scale, which is one that we've done a lot of work on and we can be continuing. But I'm going to let my panelists address this more fully.
Well, I'll just address the question on taxes and how you reduce the impact on vulnerable groups. So most of these proposed measures are consumption taxes or production taxes. So it's quite difficult to differentiate the level of taxation based on individuals who are impacted if you're taxing an entire category of goods. What you can do perhaps is exclude certain goods that are deemed fundamental, but that won't get you very far if what you're trying to do is reduce the use of fossil fuels for energy use. And so in that case, I think the other approach is to provide sustainable alternatives and subsidize sustainable alternatives. I think that's the only feasible way to deal with that issue.
Yeah, no, just a very, very brief, a very, very brief intervention in terms of the scale effect that was mentioned in one of the questions. In terms of trade liberalization, I guess one of the hopes is that the so-called eco-efficiencies can reduce the amount of trade in unsustainable sectors. And I guess that would be sort of a partial answer to that, although very incomplete. And just very briefly in terms of helping the diplomatic process, I think we've seen through the impact assessments and through this process that's really been attempting to integrate environmental and social considerations into the trade agenda, a very direct actually impact on the diplomatic process, at least on the regional trade agreement level. And I'd go further and say that this has to happen now in world finance law. For instance, it would be great to see impact assessments for the Basel Committee. Just putting that out there.
That's your research agenda for the next 10 years, isn't it? Marcus, please go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly to Hector, I think you will find that A, investment law has moved on from the early days, and B, the way you design the measure actually matters a great deal when it comes to international economic law broadly. So I don't see NAFTA Chapter 11 as a hindrance for Mexico to transition to a green economy. good legal advice to the government from the environmental law and other communities is certainly necessary. I just wanted to make one point on the big picture. Aren't we operating in the wrong paradigm? And I think it also has a link to the bilateral versus multilateral. Yeah, of course, in an ideal world, we would have multilateral conventions that have as much bite as the WTO or the investment regime. But bar that, I think we need to, as lawyers, be more prepared to look at individual countries and maybe, to a certain extent, look at unilateral measures and see how the international regimes react to these unilateral measures. Why am I so comfortable with this? We wouldn't have any noise standards for aviations if it hadn't been for the unilateral imposition of noise standards by the EU. That unilateral imposition then forced the ICAO to discuss noise standards, and while we didn't end up with the EU standard, we ended up with some noise reduction standard in the international forum. And I think if negotiations don't get us anywhere, more bold unilateral measures might get us at least part of the way to where we need to go.
Wow, well, that could really start a whole new conversation. All right, thank you for that flaming provocative remark, which we've been asking for. Yes, sure. Sarah?
So the relationship between the CDM and the green economy, the very, very short answer is that it's one amongst many mechanisms, I think, in the green economy that can promote that kind of low-carbon, climate-resilient pathway. So it's part of that regime complex for the green economy. The longer, but yet still very short answer is that the CDM was held out as part of kind of a global comprehensive solution to climate change along with emissions trading and targeted commitments. And it was also supposed to be meant for sustainable development. So if you look at the project approval cycle, sustainable development was actually in there as one of the criteria. That said, if we look at the green economy as something broader that takes into account other concepts of environmental protection, the CDM may not address those issues. In addition to that, we also see that the CDM hasn't been scaled up to the extent that we want. So it still remained at the project level, meaning that it wasn't mainstreamed into the economy.
I want to thank everyone for participating and for being so patient during their lunch. I especially want to thank, of course, the people who put together the menu and the buffet of ideas. And of course, I have to thank our hosts, ICTSD, for opening the space for this conversation, as well as the Jean Monnet Chair for Sustainable Development Law at the University of Ottawa for opening it. There are obviously many key issues that are not only unresolved, but indeed only just beginning to be looked at. You have signaled some of the most important ones here. There are more as well, but we will certainly be taking into account your advice as the legal research proceeds and also as the work of hopefully the other organizations here is continued. Thank you very much.